All right, welcome back in on this Tuesday. It is NewsWire here on the SportsGrid Network. I'm Joe Raineri in for Craig Mish here today, and we've got plenty on the legal front in the sports betting space here, and nobody better to help us navigate through some of the top stories than the Legal Sports Report's Jim Gazzale stepping in here. And Jim, let's start in Nebraska, who has a special session going on that talks about online sports betting, I guess, are heating up. What's the latest here in Nebraska?
Yeah, of course, it's not really the time that we typically talk about potential states legalizing online sports betting. And of course, Nebraska already has retail sports betting just at a handful of regional casinos around the state. So legalizing online sports betting in Nebraska got brought up for discussion mid last week during their special session. Governor Jim Pillen is looking for ways for the state to combat somewhat of a property tax crisis, as he called it, for its residents. So one of the options that's been put on the table is legalizing online sports betting. They talked about it at length at a general affairs committee hearing last week on Wednesday, spoke about it for about 3 hours. No action was ultimately taken. So we're still waiting to see if it lands on another agenda for this week where it can be brought up for another discussion and perhaps potentially be voted on in some way to advance it forward through this special session. So what they're calling for is basically just opening it up to the online apps to come in and regulate the product that way. GeoComply, that geofencing technology company that helps out the online sports books with location targeting and whatnot. They appeared at the hearing on Wednesday, pushing in favor of legalized online sports betting in Nebraska, and they said that they've seen in the first 6 months this year 40,000 accounts cross state lines from Nebraska into other states, 80% of those going into Iowa to place legal sports bets there. And one senator from Nebraska is saying that the state is giving up $32 million a year in sports betting tax revenue by not having it legalized. If they do take action on this bill here in the next couple of weeks, it would create a constitutional amendment and basically put it in front of voters in November. If they don't take it up now, Governor Pillen has said that he will put a priority bill in place in January to legalize it that way. If they do wait until January to start discussing it further during their typical legislative session, that would push that constitutional amendment out until 2026, which that one senator, Elliot Bostar, says would cost the state about $100 million. So nothing on the agenda so far for this week. That page on their website I checked just before we came on, Joe, has not been updated yet, though we are expecting to most likely see that come back for a little bit more discussion in the coming days and weeks, and ultimately see what happens with that online sports betting legislation in Nebraska.
Yeah, that's an amazing number of people crossing over there. That had to be pretty eye-opening for the legislature there to take a look, and that's money that should be staying inside the state of Nebraska there. What in the world here, Jim? Can't we all just get along, New York Racing Association and Churchill Downs? Like, what is going? Every time I turn around, it feels like there's an argument here with these tracks and platforms. What's the latest now?
Yeah, so NYRA and Churchill Downs were a little bit of a content contract dispute last week that ultimately got resolved rather quickly. I think you've got the two biggest players in the horse betting space, and they both removed each other's respective content from their platforms last week. What NYRA was asking for ultimately was an additional 1% source market fee from these other ADWs, the horse betting app, which Twin Spires that Churchill Downs operates. And Churchill Downs basically said, pound sand. And, I'm not exactly sure, who blinked first or what the ultimate terms of the agreement were. But this past weekend was the Whitney Stakes up here in Saratoga, which is traditionally one of the highest volume handle weekends in New York and really throughout the country. So as one might expect, the two sides came to an agreement just before that big weekend. And, Joe, like you said off the top, NYRA was in another content dispute with FanDuel over the July 4th holiday weekend. And that cost them NYRA cost them a pretty penny in handle. And, ultimately those two sides came together. But, you're right, Joe. It's like, why can't we all just get along? Arguably the three biggest players in the horse betting space, just kind of sparring over content, everybody trying to get the best deal possible. And, ultimately the argument from the fans and the horse players is they're the ones that are losing. These big dollar entities are trying to, squeeze as much as they can from each other, and ultimately not making that content available widespread across every app, just really hinders the ability for horse racing to kind of advance and compete with all these other forms of online betting, namely sports betting. But, the little dispute between NYRA and CDI, with a couple of strongly worded quotes flying back and forth, ultimately lasted, less than 48 hours. And all of the content is back on the NYRA Bets app and on the Twin Spires app for New York racing and all of the different tracks that Churchill Downs operates across the country.
Yeah, I mean, listen, with FanDuel and other, they have enough competition, so you'd think they would all get on the same page there, Jim, and it would be better for everyone, including the player. And finally, what about Ohio? I guess the latest numbers are out here, and I guess all of a sudden Bet365 is a player in Ohio. Is that what we're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, they're kind of in that second rung of players, I guess you would say, and they've really, established themselves as a clear number three in that market. Still a far distance behind the two market leaders in FanDuel and DraftKings, which we see in most markets across the country. But for Bet365, it's been a pretty positive first 6 months of the year. Like I said, that clear number three. And, like we were talking before we went on, Joe, I think to me, the most interesting thing so far this year has been ESPN Bet and just how well they've been performing in a lot of their markets that they're live in across the country, Ohio being one of the larger ones. And, after that big promo rush that they rolled out midway through November and into December when they launched late last year, things have kind of slid backwards for them. They're now getting outpaced by a couple others of those, second tier operators. But for FanDuel and DraftKings, still at the top end of that Ohio market, really no signs of slowing down for either of them there. FanDuel has 10 consecutive months now of clearing more than $20 million in monthly revenue. But like we said off the top, Bet365, holding their own and really cementing themselves as the number three option in the Buckeye State.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to monitor to see how it rolls there, Jim, in Ohio and Bet365, but certainly ESPN. I think that's going to be a work in progress, man. We appreciate it as always, dropping the knowledge on us, Jim, from the Legal Sports Report. We got much more still to get to here on NewsWire. We'll do so next year on The Grid.